She visited the nursing home once, but what she found changed her forever. She didn't want to go. That was the thought running through her mind as she sat in her car outside the nursing home, staring at the building as though it might swallow her whole. The beige walls, the neatly trimmed shrubs, the glass doors with their automated welcome sign. They all felt foreign, almost sterile. She tapped the steering wheel nervously, debating whether she should just drive away and make up some excuse later. After all, she wasn't here because she wanted to be. She was here because a friend had signed her up for a community service project, and backing out at the last second would make her look bad. Still, she couldn't shake the knot in her stomach that told her this was going to be awkward, maybe even unbearable. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. She finally pulled open the door, the whoosh of air conditioning hitting her face instantly. The smell was the first thing she noticed. Cleaner mixed with something faintly medicinal. The kind of smell that tells you things are being kept sterile, but also reminds you that the people inside are fragile. The receptionist gave her a polite smile and asked her to sign in, her pen scratching shakily against the paper as though her own hand wasn't sure if it wanted to cooperate. The receptionist thanked her, clipped a visitor's badge to her shirt, and pointed her toward the recreation hall where residents usually gathered. Her shoes squeaked softly against the polished floor as she walked down the hallway. She passed framed posters with slogans about dignity and care, cheerful pictures of sunflowers and smiling nurses. But the sound that lingered with her most was the low hum of television sets playing behind closed doors, and every so often, a cough or a faint call for assistance echoing down the corridor. She felt like she had stepped into a world that operated on a slower rhythm, a place where time stretched differently than it did outside. As she entered the recreation hall, her eyes scanned the room. A group of residents sat around a table playing cards. Another pair of women sat quietly by a window, their chairs angled toward the sunlight streaming in. In the far corner, a man dozed in his wheelchair, his chin resting against his chest. Nobody paid much attention to her, the newcomer with her nervous smile and uncertain posture. A staff member spotted her lingering by the door and came over with a clipboard. "You must be here for the visiting program," the staff member said kindly. "We'll match you with someone to talk to today. Just keep it simple. Introduce yourself, ask them about their day. Sometimes that's all it takes to brighten things up." She nodded, swallowing hard, trying to hide the fact that her palms were already damp. She had no idea what she was supposed to say to a stranger who lived here. Would they even want to talk to her? Would she just make things worse by reminding them of all the people who weren't visiting? The staff member led her down another hallway, this one quieter than the last. They stopped outside a room with the door halfway open, revealing a neatly made bed, a nightstand with a lamp, and a single chair by the window. "This is Mrs. Carter," the staff member whispered, knocking gently before stepping inside. An older woman sat upright in her bed, her silver hair combed back, her hands resting neatly in her lap. She turned her head slowly toward the doorway, her expression polite but unreadable. The young woman stepped inside, her voice catching slightly as she introduced herself. "Hello, I'm here from the visiting program." Mrs. Carter studied her for a moment, as though deciding whether she would be worth her time. Then she gave a faint nod. "All right," she said softly. Her voice was clear, steady, but there was something behind it, something tired. The young woman eased into the chair by the bed, her knees brushing against the cool metal frame. For a moment, silence hung in the room, thick enough that she could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. She forced herself to ask how Mrs. Carter was doing and received a simple "fine" in return. No elaboration, No invitation. Just a word that closed the conversation almost as quickly as it began. She folded her hands in her lap, searching for something else to say, feeling the weight of her own discomfort pressing down on her. It struck her then how much easier it would have been to stay in her car, to drive away, and never know what this moment felt like. But she was here now, and for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she realized she needed to stay. Something about the quiet in this room, about the look in Mrs. Carter's eyes, told her that leaving wasn't an option. Not today. Not when there might be something important waiting beneath the surface. And though she didn't know it yet, this single decision, to stay in that chair, to sit with a stranger who seemed uninterested, was about to change her in ways she never could have imagined. The first thing she noticed was how quiet everything seemed once the door to Mrs. Carter's room closed behind her. The staff member had left, and now she stood alone in the hallway, her visitor badge feeling heavier than before. The sounds here were different from the front desk or the recreation hall. She heard the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the squeak of rubber soles from a nurse walking past, the faint buzz of a call button from somewhere down the hall. It wasn't silence. It was a collection of tiny sounds that together reminded her this place never truly rested. She walked slowly, almost tiptoeing, unsure of where to look or how to act. The hallway stretched longer than she expected, lined with identical doors. Each one had a small plastic nameplate and a little holder where paper signs could be slipped in. Some doors had balloons taped to them, or flowers perched on the shelf outside. Others were bare. She tried not to linger, but she couldn't help noticing how these details told their own quiet stories. Turning the corner, she saw the recreation hall again, this time from another angle. The room looked brighter now, its wide windows letting in the late afternoon sun. A television was playing softly in the background, showing an old game show. The sound was low, but every time the contestants clapped, a couple of residents clapped along too, even if they weren't watching. It made her smile faintly, though the smile faded just as quickly when she noticed how many people weren't engaged at all. Some sat in wheelchairs, eyes drifting shut as though sleep was easier than conversation. Others stared at nothing in particular, their gazes fixed on the air between them and the window. A few had visitors, adult children or maybe grandchildren, sitting beside them, talking quietly. These conversations felt like rare treasures, the kind you had to notice before they slipped away. She stopped near a vending machine, pretending to look at the choices while she gathered herself. She didn't want to appear lost or out of place, but the truth was, she felt both. She told herself she'd just stay for a little while longer, just long enough to say she had come and done her part. That was what this program was about, wasn't it? Show up, spend a little time, make someone feel less alone. And yet, something inside her whispered that she was already seeing more than she had bargained for. A nurse noticed her standing there and gave a gentle smile. "First time visiting?" the nurse asked, adjusting a stack of blankets she carried. "Yes," she admitted, her voice lower than she meant it to be. "You'll get used to it. They don't always show it, but it means a lot to them. Sometimes just sitting is enough." The nurse nodded encouragingly before heading off, leaving her with a piece of reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. She walked further into the hall, her steps slower now. She passed a bulletin board pinned with flyers, art therapy on Thursdays, sing-alongs on Saturdays, a reminder about flu shots. Taped to the corner was a collage of photographs, residents holding paintbrushes, laughing with volunteers, wearing silly hats for a holiday party. She paused, studying the faces. They looked alive in those moments, full of joy and connection. But looking around the hall now, she wondered how often those moments really happened. Her eyes drifted back toward the corner where Mrs. Carter's room was. Something about that meeting still lingered in her chest. the way Mrs. Carter had looked at her, the way her fine had closed the door on conversation. It had unsettled her. She realized that first impressions here weren't like first impressions anywhere else. In the outside world, you judged someone by their smile, their handshake, their clothes. Here, first impressions were shaped by silence, by the weight of unspoken things, by the years of waiting that sat behind a person's eyes. She returned to the chair she had left earlier in the recreation hall, sitting this time with less hesitation. From this seat, she could observe without seeming intrusive. The card players were still at it, shuffling their worn deck, bickering good-naturedly over the rules. One of them caught her eye and gave a small nod as if to say, "See, it's not so bad here." She returned the nod awkwardly, wishing she had the courage to strike up a conversation. But she didn't. Not yet. She just sat, her hands folded, her mind restless. The smell of coffee drifted in from the cafeteria nearby, mingling with the faint scent of disinfectant. It reminded her again that this place was both home and institution, warm and cold at the same time. When she finally stood to leave the hall, she felt a strange pull. She had come expecting an hour of small talk and nothing more. Yet the longer she stayed, the more the details seeped in. The vacant stares, the half-finished conversations, the nurse's reassurance, all of it worked its way under her skin. She didn't know why, but something told her she hadn't even begun to understand what this place really held. And as she made her way back toward Mrs. Carter's room, she realized this visit wasn't going to let her remain a spectator. Whether she liked it or not, she was already being drawn into stories she hadn't expected to hear, and some of those stories might not leave her the same. She returned to Mrs. Carter's room with hesitant steps, her hand brushing the visitor badge as though it might steady her nerves. The door was still half open, the same way it had been before. She peeked inside and saw Mrs. Carter sitting in the exact same position, upright in her bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It was as if time in this room had not moved at all. "May I come back in?" she asked, her voice gentle, unsure if she was intruding. Mrs. Carter turned her head slowly, giving the smallest nod. "If you'd like." She stepped in and sat down in the same chair as before, the metal legs scraping lightly against the floor. For a moment, she just looked around the room, searching for something to comment on. There wasn't much, just a lamp, a clock, a dresser with a folded blanket on top. Her eyes landed on a framed photograph resting on the nightstand. It showed a younger woman, smiling widely, with her arm wrapped around a man in uniform. The photo looked worn, its edges fading, but it stood out in the otherwise plain room. "That's a beautiful picture," she said softly, pointing toward it. "Is that you?" Mrs. Carter's eyes flickered toward the frame. For the first time, a faint smile tugged at her lips. "Yes, that was many years ago." "You look so happy there," the young woman said, leaning forward slightly. "Who's with you?" "My husband," Mrs. Carter replied, her voice quiet but steady. "He was in the service." That picture was taken right before he left for his last deployment. The young woman nodded, sensing a shift. The silence didn't feel as heavy as before. There was an opening now, however small, and she didn't want to let it close. "Did you travel with him much? Or stay here?" she asked. Mrs. Carter chuckled faintly, a sound that carried both warmth and sadness. "Oh no, I stayed here. Raised our children, kept the house running. He was gone more than he was home. That's just how life was back then." Her words carried a weight the young woman couldn't ignore. She looked at Mrs. Carter closely, noticing the way her eyes softened when she spoke of the past. It was clear that behind her reserved exterior was a lifetime of stories some of which might never have been told if not for a question about a photograph. Encouraged, she asked another, "Do your children live nearby?" Mrs. Carter's smile faded. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tightening slightly. "Not really. They have their lives. Busy, you know." The young woman shifted uncomfortably. She didn't know what to say. She thought of her own family, of how often she brushed off her mother's phone calls because she was too busy. The realization stung. The silence stretched again, and she worried she had said the wrong thing. But then Mrs. Carter spoke, her voice softer now. "People mean well. They just forget. That's the hardest part." The words landed heavily in the young woman's chest. She nodded slowly, not out of politeness but because she understood, at least a little, what Mrs. Carter meant. Forgetting didn't always come from a lack of love. Sometimes it came from being wrapped up in your own world. Wanting to lighten the mood, she glanced around for another subject. On the dresser, she noticed a small stack of books. "Do you read much?" she asked. Mrs. Carter's eyes lifted. "I used to. My eyes aren't as sharp as they once were, but I still enjoy listening when someone reads aloud." The young woman smiled. "Maybe next time I visit, I could read to you. If you'd like." Mrs. Carter gave her a long look, as though measuring the sincerity of the offer. Then she nodded. "I'd like that." It was the first time during the visit that the room felt lighter. The tension had eased, replaced by a fragile but real connection. The young woman sat a little straighter, no longer fidgeting with her hands. She wasn't just passing time anymore. She was starting to see the person in front of her. And in that small, unexpected shift, she realized something important. This visit wasn't going to be about filling silence. It was going to be about listening, about noticing the details others might walk past. Mrs. Carter might not say much at first, but when she did, her words carried more weight than anything the young woman had prepared to hear. She hadn't come looking for meaning, but meaning had found her anyway. She returned the next week, this time walking through the front doors with a little less hesitation. The receptionist smiled at her again and handed her the same visitor badge, and she clipped it on without fumbling. When she reached the room, the door was open wider than before. Mrs. Carter was sitting in her chair by the window instead of the bed this time, a light blanket over her lap. Sunlight spilled across her shoulders, highlighting the silver in her hair. She looked up when the young woman entered, her eyes narrowing slightly before recognition settled in. "You came back," she said. "Of course," the young woman replied, easing into the chair beside her. "I said I would." Mrs. Carter gave a small nod, as though she had not fully expected anyone to keep that kind of promise. The silence that followed didn't feel as heavy as before. It was as though the thin thread they had spun during the last visit hadn't broken. Her eyes drifted again toward the photograph on the nightstand. She pointed to it gently. "I was thinking about this picture the other day. You looked so happy there. What was he like? Your husband?" Mrs. Carter's gaze lingered on the photo. Her lips curved faintly. "Stubborn," she said, a trace of amusement in her tone. "He believed in hard work. He believed in doing things the right way, even if it took longer. And he loved to laugh, though you wouldn't know it from the way he posed for pictures." The young woman leaned in. "How did you meet?" That question seemed to open something. Mrs. Carter shifted slightly in her chair, her voice steady but lighter than before. "At a town dance. I was 17. My friend dragged me there even though I didn't want to go. I thought he was too serious at first, but he asked me to dance and then, well, that was that." As she listened, the young woman found herself smiling. The story wasn't extraordinary, but it was personal. It was a glimpse into a life that had stretched far beyond these quiet walls. She realized how much of a privilege it was to be invited into those memories. Wanting to keep the flow, she asked, "Did you two dance a lot after that?" Mrs. Carter chuckled softly. "Not much. He had 2 left feet. But when the radio played in the kitchen, he'd take my hand and we'd shuffle around until the children laughed at us." Her eyes glistened slightly, though she blinked the emotion away. "It's funny the things you remember. The little things." The young woman nodded, feeling the truth in those words. She thought of her own life, the details she often overlooked. Would she remember the big achievements, or the quiet moments in the kitchen, years from now? They sat for a while in easy conversation. The young woman noticed the stack of books again and remembered her promise. "I brought something," she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a slim paperback. "I thought I could read to you, if you're still interested." Mrs. Carter studied her, then gave a slow nod. "Yes, please." She opened the book and began to read. Her voice felt shaky at first, but soon it smoothed into a rhythm. Mrs. Carter closed her eyes, listening, her expression relaxed. For a few minutes, the room was filled only with the sound of the story. The young woman felt strangely grounded, as if the simple act of reading aloud had anchored them both in something meaningful. When she stopped, Mrs. Carter opened her eyes and gave the faintest of smiles. "That was nice. You read well." The compliment was small, but it settled deep. And as she gathered her things to leave, Mrs. Carter surprised her with a final sentence. "You'll come again, won't you?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "I will." And she meant it. This time, she wasn't just saying the words. She was already thinking of when she could come back. She noticed the difference the moment she sat down with Mrs. Carter again. The woman was polite as always, her posture straight, her tone measured. But this time, there was something underneath her carefully chosen words. The young woman sensed it in the pauses, in the way Mrs. Carter's gaze drifted to the window when questions touched too close to the heart. "Did your children ever come with you to those dances?" she asked lightly, trying to keep the conversation flowing. Mrs. Carter's lips pressed together. "No, not for many years now." But then Mrs. Carter surprised her. Her voice was quieter now, her words slipping out as if she had decided to trust the air between them. "They don't visit often. Life keeps them busy. Birthdays, holidays, those come and go without them. Sometimes months pass, sometimes longer." The young woman's throat tightened. She forced herself to meet Mrs. Carter's eyes, and what she saw there unsettled her. Loneliness, deep and unspoken, lingered behind the measured tone. Not bitterness, not anger, just a quiet ache. She didn't know what to say. "That must be hard," she offered, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Carter gave a small shrug. "You get used to it. People mean well, but their lives move faster than yours does. And one day you realize the phone rings less, the mail comes lighter, and the faces you love most are the ones you see only in photographs." The young woman swallowed hard, her chest tight with guilt she didn't fully understand. She thought about her own parents, the times she let their calls go to voicemail, the times she promised to visit but didn't. She thought it was just life, the way everyone moved. But sitting here, hearing this truth from a woman who had lived it, she realized how easily busy could become absent. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was heavy with meaning. She sat with it, letting Mrs. Carter's words sink in. For the first time, she wasn't looking for a way to fill the space. She was just present, and it seemed that presence itself mattered. After a while, she asked softly, "Do you ever get other visitors?" "Friends?" Mrs. Carter shook her head. "Most of my friends have already gone." "That's the way it happens here. You make friends, and then one day they aren't at the table anymore." The words sent a chill through her. She looked around the room, at the clock ticking steadily on the wall, at the chair she sat in, at the simple furniture that filled the space. It struck her that for many here, these four walls were the whole world. The outside world had shrunk until it no longer reached them. Mrs. Carter folded her hands tightly together. "It's not the nurses. They do their best. But it's different when someone comes just to see you. Not because they're paid to, but because they want to." Her voice caught faintly on the last word, and she quickly cleared her throat, brushing it off. The young woman felt her chest ache with a mixture of sorrow and determination. She realized this wasn't about volunteering or ticking off hours for some program. This was about showing up, about not letting someone feel forgotten. She leaned forward slightly. "Well, I want to be here," she said quietly. And she meant it. She didn't even realize until she spoke that it was true. For the first time, Mrs. Carter looked at her with something softer than politeness. Gratitude. The kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The young woman sat back in her chair, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't quite name. She had come expecting surface-level conversation, maybe a few smiles. But what she had found was something deeper. The hidden loneliness of people who had given so much of their lives, only to be left in the quiet. And though she couldn't solve it all, she understood something now. Sometimes the smallest act, just being there, just listening, was bigger than she realized. And she wasn't sure she would ever see visits the same way again. She walked into the room the following week carrying 2 cups of tea. One for herself, one for Mrs. Carter. It felt strange at first, bringing something so simple, but it was her way of saying she wanted to share, not just sit politely in the chair by the bed. Mrs. Carter looked up as she entered, her eyebrows raising in mild surprise. "You brought something?" she asked. "I wasn't sure what you liked," the young woman admitted, "but I thought maybe we could both use something warm today." Mrs. Carter accepted the cup with both hands, nodding slowly. "Tea is fine." "Thank you." They sat quietly for a while, sipping. The warmth in her hands steadied the young woman's nerves, making the silence less intimidating. She glanced around the room again, her eyes landing on a crocheted blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed. The colors, soft blues and pale pinks, looked handmade. She leaned forward. "Did you make that?" Mrs. Carter followed her gaze and let out a faint chuckle. "I did. Years ago. I used to crochet all the time. My hands aren't as quick as they once were." The young woman's eyes widened. "Really?" "I tried once, but I couldn't even manage a straight line." "How long did it take you to learn?" "Oh, I ruined plenty of yarn at the beginning," Mrs. Carter said with a small smile. "But it kept my hands busy when the children were little. Cheaper than buying toys, too. They'd drag those blankets around until they were threadbare." Something in her voice softened as she said it, and the young woman found herself smiling too. "I draw sometimes." "Not well, but it helps me clear my mind. I guess it's the same idea." Mrs. Carter tilted her head, curious. "What do you draw?" "Mostly people. Faces. I've always been fascinated by how much you can see in someone's expression. Even if it's just a sketch, you capture something that feels alive." For the first time since they met, Mrs. Carter's interest lit up in her eyes. "You should bring one of your drawings sometime. I'd like to see." The suggestion startled her. No one outside of a small circle of friends had ever asked to see her work. She nodded, her cheeks warming. "Okay, I will." The conversation continued in a rhythm that felt different from their earlier visits. There were fewer long pauses, fewer guarded replies. Mrs. Carter began to share bits of her life, her favorite meals to cook, the songs she used to hum in the kitchen, the way she always planted roses in her front yard no matter how many times the frost killed them. In return, the young woman shared pieces of her own life. She talked about her job, the stress that sometimes kept her awake at night, and the little victories that made it worth it. She confessed that she often felt restless, like she was drifting without direction. To her surprise, Mrs. Carter didn't dismiss her worries as trivial. She listened. She nodded. She even offered a few words of advice, not as someone lecturing, but as someone who understood. "Restlessness isn't a curse," she said gently. "It means you still care about where you're going. The danger isn't in feeling restless, it's in stopping altogether." The young woman sat quietly with that, letting the words settle. She realized then that this wasn't just about her giving time to Mrs. Carter. She was receiving something in return, something she hadn't expected. As the afternoon wore on, they found themselves laughing at small things, the way the tea had gone cold too quickly, the squeaky wheel on the food cart in the hall, the memory of Mrs. Carter's husband trying and failing to fix their leaky sink. It wasn't forced. It wasn't polite laughter to fill silence. It was real. When it was time to leave, the young woman hesitated by the door. "You'll bring your drawings next time?" Mrs. Carter asked. "I will," she promised, and she meant it. As she walked down the hall, past the bulletin boards and the hum of televisions, she realized something had shifted. This wasn't about checking off hours anymore. This wasn't even about kindness. It was about connection, unexpected, genuine connection that had somehow found her in the quiet corner of a nursing home. And it was that connection that made her certain she would keep coming back. She carried her sketchbook tucked under her arm as she walked down the hallway that afternoon. The visitor badge clipped to her shirt no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like permission. She passed the familiar bulletin boards, the smell of disinfectant and coffee mixing in the air, and for the first time, she didn't feel out of place. She was coming here with purpose. She was coming to see Mrs. Carter. When she entered the room, Mrs. Carter was already sitting in her chair by the window, the blanket spread neatly across her lap. Her eyes flickered to the sketchbook immediately. "You brought it," she said. The young woman smiled nervously, sliding into the chair beside her. "I did. But you have to promise not to laugh." "I don't laugh at courage," Mrs. Carter replied softly. That simple sentence put her at ease. She opened the sketchbook to a page she thought was safe, a drawing of a little boy playing with a dog. The lines weren't perfect, but there was something in the child's expression she had tried hard to capture. Mrs. Carter leaned in, her eyes brightening. "That's very good. You've caught something in the way he looks at the dog. That spark. Not everyone notices details like that." The young woman's shoulders loosened. She turned the page, showing more sketches. A woman holding a cup of coffee, an old man sitting on a park bench, a pair of hands folded together. Mrs. Carter studied each one carefully, offering comments that weren't empty praise but genuine observations. It felt like the first time someone really saw her work for what it was. When she finally closed the sketchbook, Mrs. Carter rested her hands on the blanket and said, "You know, there's something I've never told anyone here." The young woman leaned forward, sensing the shift in tone. "What's that?" Mrs. Carter's gaze drifted to the photograph on the nightstand again, her voice quiet but steady. "When my husband came back from his last deployment, he wasn't the same." He smiled less. He carried things he never spoke about. I tried to reach him, but sometimes all I could do was sit in silence with him, hoping it helped. And when he passed, I realized all the things I wished I had asked him, but never did. The young woman felt her throat tighten. That must have been so hard. Mrs. Carter nodded slowly. It was. But it taught me something. People think they have endless time to ask questions, to listen, to really see each other. But time is shorter than we imagine. And when it runs out, it's not the missed opportunities to speak that haunt you. It's the missed opportunities to listen. The words settled heavily in the room. The young woman thought of her own life, the phone calls she brushed off, the moments she half listened while scrolling through her phone, the times she had been present but not really there. Her chest ached with the realization that she was guilty of the very thing Mrs. Carter described. Mrs. Carter continued, her eyes glistening but calm. That's why your drawings matter. You're paying attention. You're noticing things most people rush past. Don't lose that. The world needs people who see. The young woman blinked hard, swallowing back the emotion rising in her. She had expected stories about childhood or light-hearted memories. She hadn't expected this. An intimate truth, a lesson forged from pain. They sat together in the quiet, the ticking clock filling the space between them. For the first time, the young woman wasn't uncomfortable with the silence. She understood now that silence could hold meaning too. When it was time to leave, she stood slowly, her sketchbook pressed against her side. She looked at Mrs. Carter, who was watching her with the same steady gaze. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. Mrs. Carter gave a small nod. "You listened." That's all I needed. As she walked down the hall, her steps felt heavier, but surer. She lingered outside the nursing home longer than usual before going in that afternoon. The weight of her last visit, Mrs. Carter's story about her husband, the truth about listening, still pressed heavily in her chest. She wondered if she was ready to hear more, or if maybe this was the day she'd run out of words. But when she finally walked through the door and signed her name, she realized she wasn't there for herself anymore. She was there because Mrs. Carter was waiting. The hallway felt familiar now. She found herself moving quickly toward Mrs. Carter's room, her steps more certain than before. When she entered, Mrs. Carter was at the window again, her blanket pulled up neatly, her eyes fixed on something outside that only she could see. The young woman greeted her softly, and Mrs. Carter turned, her face relaxing at the sight. "You came back," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Of course," the young woman replied. She settled into the chair, setting her bag down at her feet. "I told you I would." For a while they talked lightly, about the weather, about the breakfast Mrs. Carter had that morning, about the flowers someone had placed in the hall. But then the conversation shifted. "Do you ever think about what matters most?" Mrs. Carter asked suddenly. The young woman blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Carter's hands folded together, her fingers pale and thin. "When you're young, you think it's the big things, houses, jobs, the way people see you. But sitting here, I realize it was the small things that mattered. The laughter at the dinner table, the walks we took when we had no money but plenty of time, even the arguments, because they meant we cared enough to fight." She paused, her eyes softening. "You don't always see it until it's behind you." The words hit hard. The young woman thought about her own life, how she rushed through days, how often she told herself she'd slow down later, when things were less busy. But here was someone who had lived the later, and was saying the small things were the ones worth noticing. She found herself leaning forward. "If you could go back, what would you do differently?" Mrs. Carter gave a long breath. I'd tell people what they meant to me more often. I'd waste less time worrying about being proper or right or admired. I'd hold my children longer. I'd ask my husband more questions instead of pretending I already knew the answers. And I'd make sure the people I loved never doubted it. The young woman swallowed hard. The honesty was raw, unpolished, and it lodged itself deep in her chest. She realized she was hearing something most people never got the chance to hear, a lifetime condensed into lessons spoken plainly, without pretense. You still can, the young woman said gently. You can still tell them. Mrs. Carter gave a sad smile. Perhaps. But time doesn't always give you second chances. That's why you mustn't wait. That's why you must do it now, while you can. The room grew quiet. The young woman didn't try to fill it. She understood now that silence wasn't empty. It was space for the truth to breathe. She sat with it, letting the weight of Mrs. Carter's words settle into her bones. When the visit ended, she stood slowly, almost reluctantly. Mrs. Carter looked up at her, her eyes steady. Don't forget what I told you, she said softly. I won't, the young woman promised. And she meant it. As she walked back through the hallway, past the posters and the chatter of the staff, something in her felt changed. The visit had begun as a duty, but now it was something far more personal. What she had heard today wasn't just a story. It was a reminder that life was fragile, that time was short, and that the things we overlook might be the very things that matter most. And she knew, without question, that she would never carry herself through the world the same way again. She woke up the next morning still thinking about Mrs. Carter's words. That week, she did things differently. She called her mother and let the conversation stretch longer than usual, listening instead of rushing to hang up. She told a friend how much their support meant during a difficult season, words she had thought about but never spoken. She even wrote a letter to her younger brother, apologizing for the times she brushed him off. These were small gestures, but each one felt urgent, necessary. When she returned to the nursing home, she no longer walked in with hesitation. The receptionist knew her by name now, smiling as she handed her the visitor badge. The hallway didn't feel cold anymore. The sounds, the smells, even the silence. They felt familiar, like part of a place she belonged. Mrs. Carter looked up when she entered, her expression brightening in a way the young woman had not seen before. It wasn't a polite smile. It was recognition, relief, maybe even joy. "You're back," she said, her voice lighter. "Of course," the young woman replied. She took her usual chair and leaned forward. "I wouldn't miss it." Their time together felt different now. Less like visitor and resident, more like two people meeting in the middle of their lives. They talked, they laughed. Sometimes they sat quietly without speaking at all. As the visit drew to a close, Mrs. Carter reached out and touched her hand lightly. "You remind me that I'm still seen," she said softly. The words brought a lump to her throat. She squeezed Mrs. Carter's hand gently, unable to speak past the emotion. When she finally stood to leave, she felt a certainty settle in her chest. And as she drove away, she knew she would be back again. Not out of duty, but out of love. Always out of love. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.